So I've had the Fujifilm GFX 50R on loan from Fujifilm for about 3 weeks now. They were kind enough to loan me the 50R plus two lenses, the 32-64 f4 and the 110 f2. So I got to play with those two lenses and the 50R for coming up on 3 weeks now in exchange for making a review and talking about them. Now, I mentioned this before, but they don't require me to say anything at all. They just basically send me the gear and say, have at it, have it back by this date. And I love that. So before we get into it, I will have a slideshow showing all my favorite images from this camera and the two lenses towards the end. So there will be a timestamp in the description if you want to skip towards that, or if you just want me to stop talking and go straight to that. But I will be talking about how it was to use this camera, and just basically everything from the usability to the image quality to just the enjoyment factor of using a camera like this. First of all, the build quality is excellent. All the buttons seem to be really well made, and it just feels like a solid and robust camera. The functionality is just like you'd expect from a Fujifilm. It's fun to use, and being a medium format camera, it is bigger than what I'm used to, but it feels really nice in the hands. Like, I have decently big hands, and the grip, without using like a thumb grip like I normally would on my X-T1 or X-T2, without having something like that, it does feel really, really nice in my hands, I think. Here it is, kind of side by side with my X100T to give you kind of an idea of how beefy and big this camera is. Although for a medium format sensor, it's not that big. So here it is with the 32-64. Now the lenses are just inherently bigger. It's just a really wide opening to cover that medium format sensor. And then by nature, your lenses are just going to be bigger. But I really think that they fit well on this. And it's all about how you hold the camera. If you hold with the left hand, the lens and the body, and then with your right hand, you just grip the camera and that's it. It really fits nicely in the hands. And here's the 110, which is a monster of a lens. It is a big lens, it's heavy, but it is a beautiful piece of glass. And depending on how you hold it, how you hold the camera body, it actually feels nice to hold. So really, functionality and the build quality and the usability, to me, this was a very enjoyable camera to use. Now, you'll notice that they took the D-pad off of this camera, and typically that's not something I would like because I use the D-pad for custom function buttons. And their solution a lot of times is to say, well, we have swipe features on the touchscreen, and I personally hate swipe features because I don't want to feel like I'm using a smartphone. I want to have the functionality and the feeling that like I'm using a camera, not a smartphone. But what I will say is they actually gave us function buttons, in place of that D-pad. So there are, I think, 4 different function buttons, and I just mapped what I would use, the D-pad for to those buttons. Like I have a self-timer and changing my metering mode and white balance and that sort of thing. So having those function buttons really was really nice, and I didn't miss the D-pad at all because I had those. The joystick was plenty enough to navigate using a menu or to play back images. I really like the setup of this camera a lot. Now, the one thing I noticed while using this camera is the shutter sounds really slow, even though you may be using a fast shutter speed. It's kind of similar to the X-T1. The X-T1 does this as well. So you could be shooting at 1/2000th of a second, and it has a really slow sound that it sounds like you're taking something at half a second. It's just kind of fun, and I really like and enjoy the feeling of the shutter and the sound of the shutter. It's kind of something superficial, but it's still fun. Now, the autofocus system for me was perfectly adequate for anything I use this camera for. I think it's contrast based and I don't think it's phase detect. I use single point the whole time. I didn't try to use face and eye detect, but I found it really accurate and paired with these lenses fairly fast. I really didn't have any issue with sluggish or poor autofocusing performance. The one negative that I have as far as the functionality is that the tilt screen, while it does tilt horizontally up and down, it doesn't tilt vertically like you would find on the X-T2 or X-T3. And I've really grown to appreciate and love that vertical tilting ability, mainly for my real estate shoots, because I'm locked off on a tripod shooting it at about chest level. And I have vertical compositions on almost every shoot. And to be able just to pop that tilting screen out vertically is super handy and something I find really useful. I did use this on a real estate shoot with a 32-64, and there were a couple times where I would have to basically crouch down to see the back of the screen as I was shooting a vertical composition. And it's not the end of the world, but it is kind of nice to have that tilting functionality. Speaking of which, the real estate shoot I used it on, it was fun to use this camera. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed using it, even though it was locked off on a tripod. It was still fun to work with. But I will say there are some negatives to using a medium format sensor for real estate photography for me, but I'll get into those in a second. The image quality of this thing is what you would expect. It's awesome. The best image quality of any camera I've ever used, and of course I've never used any medium format before this, but the resolution is insane. And especially when you pair that with the nice glass, like all these lenses that are for it are just really superior quality. But man, the detail and the sharpness you can pull out of these files is just incredible. And not only that, but things like dynamic range at base ISO is just extraordinary. I mean, here's an example where I exposed for the sky to get those real nice highlights and then just ripped all the foreground shadows up, I think by like 3 or 4 stops, and it is so clean. I mean, I really couldn't tell any sort of degradation in the shadows, even when zoomed into 100%. The dynamic range is insane. And just the colors and the tones coming off the raw files, I just find really pleasing to work with. And honestly, it was just a joy to work with these files in Lightroom, and just the results you can get are pretty great. That being said, I shot in lossless compressed RAW, which I find is no worse than shooting in just uncompressed RAW. And my file sizes were like 45 megabytes for a picture. And my iMac is a decently spec'd out iMac. It's got 40 gigs of RAM and a good processor. So it really didn't have any trouble handling these files. But I mean, image quality is what you expect. It's going to be great. This camera is an inspiring camera and kind of lives up to that whole Fujifilm ethos of inspiring you and really making you want to go out and take pictures. And that was really evident in the fact that this inspired me to get out and take some landscapes. I had the 32-64, which is a good wide angle lens, and it kind of made me want to go get photographs. And because of that inspiration, I ended up with landscape shots that I'm really happy with. And I'm not a landscape photographer. I don't really look to do this on a daily basis. But because of the inspiration and also knowing I needed to get some shots for a review, it inspired me to go out and take photos. I want to kind of discuss some disadvantages for me as far as if I were to use this for real estate work. The biggest one would be just the larger sensor. With a smaller sensor like my APS-C X-T2, I can get a deeper depth of field with a wider aperture. So I usually shoot around 5.6 on my X-T2 for real estate. And that allows me to get a deep depth of field to get a lot in focus. But at the same time, I'm using flashes, and it allows me to get the most out of my flash power. So in other words, the more I stop down my lens, if I were to go to f8 or f11, after I take my ambient exposure, when I go to do my flash exposure, I would have to crank the power up on my flashes a lot more the smaller aperture I go. And already at 5.6 with ISO 200 on my X-T2, I'm using my flashes at 1:1 power as it is, and that gives me a great exposure. But to get the equivalent deep depth of field on a medium format, I need to be at about f11, which means I lose 2 stops of power for my flashes that are already maxed out because they're cheap flashes. So that means I would have to crank the ISO up. And in some situations on this specific shoot I was shooting at ISO 1600, which isn't ideal. So if I were to go with a medium format system for real estate, I would have to invest in beefier, more expensive flashes that have a higher output. And that's just not something I really want to do. For real estate, a smaller sensor tends to have more advantages for me. Not only that, but not having that vertical tilting screen is kind of a knock too. I like having that. That being said though, I loved every second of this camera. I had so much fun using it, and at the end of the day, this isn't a camera that I really need by any means, but what I will say is I enjoyed using it so much. I honestly haven't enjoyed using a camera this much since I initially got the X-T1. And that's the camera that made me switch to mirrorless and Fujifilm from full frame. And to say that a camera has had that sort of impact on me is really something special. As a matter of fact, I liked it so much that I went and bought one for myself. And like I said, I don't need this. I'm not going to use this on my real estate shoots. I'm not going to use it on wedding photography, although I may take it along. But this is just a camera I enjoyed using so much. It gave me so much joy and happiness that I really wanted to pick one up. So I'm not replacing my X-T2s or anything like that, but I am going to be using this in supplement to my Fuji X series. I got the 50mm f3.5 to go along with it because they were having a sale and it was half off. So it pairs really nicely with this body, and I've only had it for one day so far, and I've managed to get a couple of cool shots of just my son eating chips and my son feeding my wife some olives. But it's a really fun system. It's a joy to use, and I really grew to love it in the 3 weeks that I've had this. More so than I thought I would. There's something about it, I don't know. It's kind of like the X-T1. There's something about it that it's kind of magic. It just kind of does something to you that you just enjoy, and it's really a fun camera. So I look forward to using this for many years, and it will take me a little while to build up a lens collection for it because, man, are the lenses expensive. I may look into doing some third-party options or even some like used vintage lenses. But I'll definitely be reviewing that 53.5 sometime soon once I get a good catalog of photos built up with it. So with all that being said, here is a slideshow showing my favorite images that I took with the 32-64 and the 110, which is an amazing lens. Both lenses I thought were excellent, and man, were they sharp. And the 110, the look you can get from that was just insane. You can shoot a subject that's small in the frame, zoom in to 200%, and he's tack sharp, and it's just ridiculous. So at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy the pictures that are about to come. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.